Hey art nerds! So in my last couple videos I did time lapses of me inking comic pages. I gave it some thought and I realized that I haven't really walked you guys step by step through how I would ink a comic page. And I think one of the best ways to do that is to ink a couple of panels and sort of narrate what I'm doing as I go along, just so that those of you who are interested in inking and don't have any experience at all can kind of see what's going on and maybe get a clearer idea of how to go about inking your own comic. My best advice though is to A, just watch other inking videos, even time lapses, and B, just start learning, start practicing, start making mistakes. Mistakes are a good thing and that's how you learn. So what we are using for today's tutorial is we have our blue lines which have been penciled with an HB lead, and these are on Canson Montball watercolor paper. So this is a cellulose watercolor paper because I'm going to watercolor this later. You may also wish to use Bristol if you are inking comics, or mixed media paper. I think I have a little bit more information on that over at nattosoup.blogspot.com, so make sure you check the description for relevant links as well as the cards. I'm going to be inking with a Sakura Pigma FB. This is a very small brush pen. I have videos here on this channel about inking with nibs, inking with brushes, but for comics generally I want simple, something that's easy to use, something that's very portable. So brush pens are some of my favorites, and the reason I am using a Sakura Pigma FB is it is alcohol marker and waterproof, so when I watercolor over it the ink isn't going to run. I also have over here a clear acrylic ruler with gridding on it, and this one came from Muji, and it has an inking edge. Some people also call that a cutting edge. And off to the side I have a paper towel that I'm going to use to wipe it down after I've used the ruler to help me pull straight edges. Now, one of the reasons I don't do a lot of videos where I narrate as I ink is because I use controlled breathing to help me pull my lines. So the speaking, the talking, the narration in this video is going to be a little bit awkward and a little bit stilted, and that's because I am speaking when it is convenient for me, not necessarily when it would be best. I know that sounds really weird. You guys will probably see what I'm talking about as this video progresses. So I'm going to start by kind of explaining this panel here, our first panel, and I don't necessarily want to narrate this as I ink because it's a more complicated panel. There's a few things going on, and just trying to juggle narrating and making good decisions as I ink, it's a little bit daunting. But I did kind of want to walk you guys through my thought process. So usually when I'm inking a panel, I will ink foreground to background, or I will ink people first and then ink the background. And I've explained in other videos that I often will ink the face first because the face is the most important part of a person generally. And if you make a mistake, people are more likely to notice it if you made the mistake on the face. So for this panel, I guess I would begin with Naomi on her bike, go ahead and get that out of the way, then maybe ink some of the foreground trees and then work my way to the back. Okay, so now that I have Naomi ink, that's basically the hard part down. The rest is just going to be kind of free-handed stuff and working with a ruler. I do want to, I don't know how they got so catawampus, but I definitely want to straighten out these support beams on the house. So that is something I will probably get to work on after I've inked this foreground tree. So if you were inking for black and white, you might want to add a lot more detail to this tree, kind of depending on your art style, because leaves and foliage, adding that sort of texture can be a really good way to show lighting and give kind of an atmospheric vibe. But since we're going to be doing this in watercolor, I'm going to leave it pretty light. And inking organic things like trees, flowers, grass, those are some of my favorite things to ink because they're really easy to do. And unless you just really make a huge mistake, which you probably won't, it doesn't really matter all that much. People are not going to be as likely to notice goofs because they're not looking for symmetry. That's really one of the things that makes inking faces so difficult, is we're looking for symmetry, we're looking for how the features in the face are spaced out, we're looking for consistency. Whereas that's not something most readers expect from trees, from grass, from flowers. And since it doesn't require as much precision, I have a tendency to lighten up a little bit and not choke down so hard on the pin. So you guys see, I'm pretty heavy-handed. I will like death grip, and that can be really detrimental. I've been having a lot of hand and wrist problems. So if you're still young enough, and that could be any age, I guess I could learn a new grip too. But if you're still young enough to learn a new grip and to practice good, I want to call it like hand hygiene, but I don't mean hygiene like, oh, your hands are clean. I mean like doing stretches, doing warm-ups, basically not running your hands into the ground. If you don't have arthritis yet, I'm sure you want to avoid getting arthritis. So you guys can see it's really pretty easy. Since this is an outdoor shot, we might opt to maybe go a little heavier with the ink. So I'm going to start inking some of these straight lines in the background. Now in the past, I've recommended that you guys switch over to a technical pen for something like this, but I'm actually going to do it with my brush pen. I've gotten pretty good at it, and I'm using the inking edge, and I want to make sure I have everything all lined up. That's when we're having a gridded ruler. Having a gridded ruler can really be helpful. Now, the camera is definitely in the way, very much in my line of sight, so I'll do my best to work around it, and I apologize if my big old nose gets in the way. Wipe it down so we don't get any linking, and basically I am inking the objects that are on top of each other. So you see the roof of the garage or the roof of the carport is over these stability structures, so I'm going to ink the roof of the carport first and just kind of work my way down. And I move the paper in order to get the best angle I can for what I'm doing. This gets a little bit difficult because my desk is a little small when you consider I have all this recording equipment on it, and it also has some storage function. So you really want to give yourself lots of room to work, and you want to work on a nice, clean, hard surface. Let's try fix this up by actually squaring it with the redrawn roof. You can see I was really off. I don't know how I got so off. It happens. That's why we give ourselves multiple stages where we can make corrections. And I'm just going to do the same thing for our Okay, so now that I have some of those important structural lines inked in, I can start working on the grass and some of the trees, and then I'll go. So grass is actually really easy. You just need to concentrate on giving the impression of there being grass rather than like trying to fill the entire yard or land or property, whatever, with grass. So I basically draw it in along like borders of walkways, kind of on either side to show that, you know, the grass is growing on the other side. And then just here and there in the yard, just enough to show like grass clumps. So it's sort of a forest for the tree situation. You're not trying to draw every blade of grass ever. You're really just kind of trying to give an impression of there being grass. And when we're as pulled out as we are here, just keeping it really simple is a great way to very easily draw grass. And I drew that planter too big, like way too big. Shh, don't telling me, okay? Maybe no one will notice. Grass is one of the easier ones to draw, so that's why I tend to fill my environments with it. It's easy, looks half decent, and I'm fairly quick to draw too, and it's also easy on my hands. Wow, do not know what's going on with my voice. You can't see what I'm doing. Give me a sec. Oh, there we go. All right, now I don't sound like I swallowed a frog. Maybe not do that. I like frogs. So you guys can probably see it's starting to come together. And I know a lot of people like their pencils or their sketches better than their inks. For one, it does tend to be a little bit looser, a little bit more lively, and that's often one of the qualities that they like, that they feel is lost when they're inking. And I've also read that when you're sketching and you do multiple lines, it kind of creates a stereoscopic effect where your brain sees it as being a little more 3D than it actually is. So your brain is interpreting the sketch as more lifelike, whereas inks are often very clean. Not always, but often very clean. By using something like a brush pen, what I'm using here, I can get varied line weights, and I find that that adds a little bit more liveliness to the illustration that was originally lost. And I'm also drawing little inclusions in the leaves. So a lot of the detail that I'm going to add, if I'm going to add detail, since this is a pulled out shot, if you add too much detail, it starts becoming hard to parse. But so many of us, myself included, conflate loads of detail with, oh, this is a better drawing. That's why people are always so impressed when realism definitely has its challenges. I'm not here to poo-poo realism, but realism, you're working from a reference. So in that regard, you don't necessarily have to be as imaginative. Whereas when you're cartooning, you're abstracting shapes, you're abstracting forms, and there's a lot of invention. So I personally think it is harder to cartoon than it is to draw realistically. And I should probably put my money Okay, so we inked one of our more difficult panels on the page. Let's move on to something just really, really easy. Okay, so in this panel, we have Naomi kind of cradling Pancake as she's sniffling a little bit. She had a hard day at school. So normally what I would do is I would ink her hands first, then the parts of Pancake that overlap her face, then I would ink her face and work out from there. So I have here sort of my buffer sheet of paper. You guys saw me use that in our first panel. And one of the neat things about brush pens that I don't know if you guys know, but they're very pressure responsive, and some are more pressure responsive than others. Light pressure means very thin, fine lines. Heavier pressure means thicker lines, and you can really use that to your benefit when you're pulling curves. And you guys can see I'm inking her fingers in basically 2 joints. Now, real human hands have 3 joints. Whether or not you use kind of like rubber hose hand style where there's no specific joints, or 2 joints or 3 joints, it's really up to you and your personal style. I do 2 joints. I find that this works pretty well. Although I will also add a mystical 3rd joint sometimes as necessary. So often when I'm inking, just to kind of help preserve the dynamism, I will ink in additional curves or add a little bit of a curve as I'm pulling a line, just so that things feel more lively. This is particularly true for organic objects like these hands here. And then where the hands overlap, I might go back over it and just kind of bump up the line width just a little bit to kind of give the impression of depth. Okay, so now I'm going to focus on inking the parts of Pancake that overlap Naomi's face, and I'm really trying to ink with kind of a bouncy, flexible line. And when I'm pulling longer lines, like the foot right there, I either try to breathe in or breathe out. Not like, I don't try to shift breaths, if that makes sense. And we'll just thicken the line weight right there to give the implication of overlap. So generally, when you're inking, just a general rule of thumb, you're going to think about giving heavier line weights or applying heavier line weights to objects that are in your foreground, to objects that are overlapping, or to objects that are away from the light source. So it can either imply scale, importance, or lighting. And again, that's just kind of a rough approximation. You'll always find artists who handle things differently and handle them beautifully by handling them differently. That's the point of style. And inking long, smooth curves is fairly difficult for me, which is why I try to time it with my breathing. So I'm not going as full line weight as I normally would. If I were doing just black and white, I would go heavier with line weight. But since I'm going to be doing watercolor on this later, I want to leave room for the watercolor, because just in general, this is kind of a light and airy chapter. Even though Naomi herself is having a hard time, it's a pretty light and airy chapter, and I want the inks in the watercolor to reflect that. If you ink very heavily, it gives kind of this heavy weighted sensation, which could be great for like horror comics or maybe really sad auto-bio comics, or just anything that have kind of a heavier feeling. But if you want things to feel light and airy, then lighter, airier line works. Line art will work. And I personally prefer inking traditionally, because if I'm inking digitally, I can fix it 1,000 times. And the nice thing about traditional is eventually you have to be done and you have to move on. And for a comic artist who has limited time and a limited budget, or maybe entirely self-funded, you do need to have limits. And it takes a while. Like, often and I've mentioned this in other videos that I'm guilty of it. You guys can see it's taking a while, and it's taking longer because I'm talking. But often artists will time lapse things like inking, because it can be, well, talking over it is distracting and it makes it take longer, and you're not necessarily going to do as good a job as you would have done if you weren't inking over it. And also, inking in real time is often something viewers think is kind of boring. My mom would compare it to watching paint dry, which, you know, I do painting tutorials too, so there's plenty of watching paint dry here on this channel. All right, I'm going to go with a heavier line weight for underneath her jaw. But I point it out just because I've noticed that I start saying that, oh, I work slow, when I don't actually work slow. There are, of course, people who work faster than me, but don't necessarily work slow. And a lot of my viewers or people who take my classes, they also apologize for working slow. And they don't work slow. You do get faster as you do things. The more you do something, the easier it's going to get, the faster it's going to get. So they're not, for their amount of experience, they're not slow. But I do think it's worth mentioning, since so many of us do time lapse or speed up our videos and then don't mention it. I don't want to give the impression that this is like a really quick process. It's really a good process to kind of take your time, hit a stride, listen to some relaxing music, or watch something that's very chill. If possible, and I know when we're working, when we're hustling for our bread, we don't always get to decide if we're gonna, like, how we're gonna feel when we have to work. But if possible, I would recommend inking when you're not angry, not upset, not sad. And that way you have more controlled movement. You don't have all that excess adrenaline going through you. I will have basically inked this entire panel in real time just to kind of give you guys an idea of what you can expect and how much time you should give yourself. This is definitely not a process that you should rush. I'm also going really light or almost non-existent with texture since I am going to be painting this later. And I use kind of a cover sheet or a blotter for a couple of reasons. I don't want to smear the ink or the graphite, and I also don't want any of the oils on my hands. And those are just naturally occurring. You can be a very clean person and still have hand oils. I don't want those affecting the paper surface. So generally, it takes me about 4 hours, kind of depending on what's going on the page. It takes me about 4 hours to ink a page with multiple panels. If I get into like the groove, sometimes it'll go faster. And since I'm watercoloring over this, I'm not applying any kind of corrections. I'm just gonna deal with it and accept the mistakes that I've made, which can be really frustrating sometimes, I won't lie. And just kind of hope that I can disguise them in watercolor. Because if you make corrections using most available correctional fluids, either they're going to lift up as soon as you put water on them, or they're going to leave a noticeably lighter layer. There's a few watercolor grounds that I'd like to play around with to see if I can use those as kind of a correctional tool, but it's not my favorite thing to do, to experiment on my comic pages in that regard. So I was going to test that out at another time. So you might want to fill this area here in black, that's up to you. The little space between Pancake and Naomi's face. I'm not, but I will bump up the line art just a bit. I'll bump it up on his little feeties as well. Okay, art friends, that about wraps it up. If you guys have any further questions about inking with a brush pen, inking with a brush, or inking with a nib, I recommend you guys check out my advanced inking technique playlist. And then if you still have questions, please let me know in the comments below. I'm happy to help. I teach comic classes in the Nashville area, so if you're interested in learning how to make comics in person, come down to Nashville Community Ed and take one of my making comics classes. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope it was helpful, useful, and informative for you guys, and I hope you guys are looking forward to the upcoming volume 2 of 7-inch Kara. So thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you hit that subscribe button if you're not a subscriber yet, and click the bell notification so you never miss an update, and I will see you guys again really soon. Bye guys!